the truth is that Labour's vote, the sociology of Labour's vote, doesn't map that well onto the sociology of the left behind. Not least of the reasons for that is not to do with education, it's to do with age, all right? Labour's vote is an awful lot higher amongst younger voters than amongst older voters, so why should we expect Labour voters to be particularly in favour of leaving? And even the education, I happened to have to look at this last night, which is why I know it. The biggest estimate of the difference in the Labour vote in 2015 between graduates and those with educational qualifications is 9 percentage points, and some surveys put it pretty close to 0. So the educational divide, at the moment at least, is no longer particularly reflecting Labour's vote. Now, take your point, that may be the consequence of long-term changes in Labour's vote, but I guess the question that you face as a Labour politician is which vote do you wish to chase, or at least perhaps in your case hang on to? The one you've already got, or the one that you might have had 20 years ago but perhaps sailed away an awful long time ago?
Jeff Evans and others have shown that from the late 1990s onwards, it was mainly Labour's positioning on Europe and immigration that created a significant problem among its traditional blue-collar electorate, and that initially from sort of 2001 onwards, there was a sort of drifting into apathy, and in some communities a sort of switch to parties like the BNP, but then in quite a few of those areas, it wasn't that UKIP was directly picking off Labour voters, it was also that UKIP was sort of reshuffling the opposition in those seats, picking up Conservatives, Lib Dems and some former Labour voters.
What is true of the general electorate is also true of Labour voters. The ideal solution, outcome for the modal Labour voter is to maintain free trade and to restrict immigration. All right? This is true of both Conservative and Labour voters. So it seems to me pretty clear what Labour should do. If, as it seems to be likely, that the UK's initial negotiating stance will be to try to go for a compromise and to say, yes, we want to maintain access to the single market, but we're not willing to keep freedom of movement, it seems to me it would be sensible for the Labour Party to say, yep, that sounds sensible, and by the way, make sure you deliver it. If then the EU forces the UK into a hard choice, then as I've suggested, it may well be the case that the Conservative Party will say no deal. In those circumstances, the Labour Party can then simply say, no, you've made the wrong choice, and by the way, the reason why we're having to make this choice is because you've screwed up the negotiations. It's the luxury of opposition. But it seems to me that at the moment, the Labour Party is kind of getting itself involved in an argument, ironically, between moderates who actually seem to be more willing to compromise on free trade than the left of the party, which is kind of slightly curious. But then actually, rather than getting to this argument about what do we think is an ideal outcome, I would just simply say the ideal outcome for you is to actually nail the government to the mast of delivering both, and then when they fail, to reap the reward.
You know, it's easy to be generous when in good times. It's less easy to be generous in hard times, and that is at the heart. And then, of course, we have Labour's own particular oddities in allowing its management of the party to do things that are not in line with the electorate and to move away from the position of the electorate as a whole. And it doesn't, you know, none of that is going to change any time soon. But the expecting coherence from the Labour Party at the moment, yeah, good luck. Perhaps they don't need it, as you say, Sean.
We cannot presume who will get the credit or the blame for any particular outcome to negotiations. I've already suggested that if the negotiations don't go well, quote unquote, however defined, there will then be potential for a political dispute between the government and opposition as to who should get the blame. I would suggest to you the same is equally true between the United Kingdom and the European Union. If, for example, the UK government can persuade the public that, you know what, we were terribly reasonable. We said, look, you know, we just want to cut immigration a bit, or we want an emergency break a la EFTA Norway style. And if you do that, otherwise we'll sign up to the single market. And the EU still say no. You know what, I suspect there'll be no better way to confirm people in their view that actually getting out of the European Union was a rather good idea. I mean, I think, you know, in the first session, Matthew quite rightly pointed out that there are long-term aspects to this. And the truth is the United Kingdom has never been more than a semi-detached member of the European Union, either psychologically, let alone in terms of the sum of its legal provisions. And therefore, you are talking about a public where it might be relatively easy to persuade people that it's the European Union that, by the way, is not willing to trade freely, rather than the United Kingdom. And again, I think my advice to European Union politicians is do not presume that if you push the UK to making the choice, that you will necessarily get the better of it politically.
I'm very late to it, but I'm reading Robert Tombs's History of the English at the moment, and it's a nice reminder of how often the English in particular have taken to the street when they felt that the London elite is not listening, from the sort of peasants' revolt onward. Interestingly enough, the same areas and communities that now provide the bulk of support to the UK Independence Party. So there's some interesting cultural traditions going on in those parts of the world. I don't think so. I mean, I think, as John said, everything's going to come down to framing. And if the government of the day is able to frame this as being a sort of, the latest example of an out-of-touch Brussels not responding to the pragmatism of the British people, then the beneficiary of that would be, Theresa May and her government. And let's not forget, and I'm sure Ben will have something to say on this, I mean, Theresa May's fundamentals are incredibly strong, right? I mean, she's trusted in broad terms by most people. She's seen as decisive. It's a honeymoon period, but she's seen as being most competent on the economy, on immigration, on handling Brexit. I mean, Corbyn isn't even in the ring. So the issue of agency is, if people are frustrated, where are they going to go? I don't see sort of Corbyn-led Labour Party as the beneficiary. I don't see a kind of quite weakened UK Independence Party necessarily being the beneficiary. I think much will come down to Theresa May framing herself, much like Thatcher did, as a politician who's trying to do the best for Britain and was unable to make any headway among a sort of esoteric, self-serving elite in Brussels. I mean, I imagine that's how it will be framed.
The point you make is well made, that at the beginning of the century, places like Newcastle and Devon, where I come from, with relatively few migrants, were in some ways much more concerned than, say, white Londoners. What's happened since then, however, is that concern has actually risen even in London, although not necessarily for racial reasons, but simply because of overcrowding and house prices. So in London now, a majority of people still say immigration is a problem, including many migrants themselves. But it's complex. But yes, there is and the media have a role as well. We did a report about 10 years ago that looked at anxiety about different issues like the NHS, Iraq, the economy, and we found no difference at all on virtually all issues between readers of newspapers and non-readers of print press, except on one issue, immigration. And if you read the newspapers, you were more worried about immigration.
So there's a comfortable and an uncomfortable view for, you might call sort of liberals, right? The comfortable view is that actually people who have not experienced immigration and diversity are the more hostile. So as soon as this all cascades out, everybody will have contact and it'll all be lovely and everybody will come supportive of multiculturalism and diversity. Sort of uncomfortable view is that actually that experience of ethnic and demographic change does actually fuel hostility among certain social groups, and therefore the future might be a bit bleak.
But it's while it's happening, and I think this is the tension.
Let me just come in there. Yeah. So if you look, for example, at the JRF report that I did with Ollie, we found that it was in local authorities that had experienced the sharpest increase in EU nationals over the last 10 years, where you often found the strongest support for Brexit. Now that is against some of the evidence that says, well, it's also in, well, it's not against, but that sits alongside evidence that suggests in all white areas you often also had support, strong support for Brexit. And with the Trump phenomenon now, we're seeing quite a few studies that would suggest in areas that had experienced the sharpest demographic change in recent history, they were often very sort of Trumpian in their outlook, more likely to vote for Trump. But as Ben says, I mean, what we don't know is the sort of longer-term effect of that. Is that just a short-term knee-jerk reaction? Is it a kind of, is it once you get to a certain tipping point, the sort of mythical tipping point that academics have always tried to find, which is when you hit 30%, bang, everybody becomes a bit more comfortable and easy with that new reality? Or is it a sort of more awkward, uncomfortable theory where actually the more ethnic change you have, the more uncertainty and anxiety you have among, say, white working class voters?
Actually, London is full of liberal white types, but a lot of us have migrated here from other parts of Britain. Other people have migrated out, and so that is the $60 million question. And
you're a self-selecting bunch of liberals.
On the referendum vote, there wasn't really much of a gender gap, nowhere near the extent that you see, for example, with radical right voting, where there's quite a pronounced gender gap. Most, if not all, West European states. You see that with the UKIP vote, and I'm sure we'll see it next April with the Le Pen vote. Although interestingly, there's some evidence to suggest that Marine Le Pen might be closing that gender gap, certainly compared to her father, but sort of early days. So, I mean, those would be my sort of thoughts on the gender aspect. I don't see a sort of relationship there with education too much. I mean, I think there's an interesting question mark, and this was raised by Mike Gapes, about the extent to which the coalition of sort of Brexit voters or radical right voters is actually going to start to possibly change over time, because we tend to be quite insular and esoteric in our debates in Britain. But if you look at some of the other European states, you look at, say, Austria at the moment, which has a presidential contest, which is really interesting. You know, the strongest group of supporters for the Freedom Party of Austria are young Austrians. A couple of years ago, around 42% of young Austrians said they were voting for the Freedom Party, which is the complete opposite of what we see with the UK Independence Party. So I think we sort of need to hold back from kind of jumping into, yes, this is just a sort of angry, old, white, less well-educated man. I think there's a lot more fluidity. I mean, Ben made this point about the Brexit vote, but there's a lot more fluidity. I expect there may still be more fluidity to come in the future.
Obviously, you cannot replicate CETA because it's a Canada-specific agreement, but the Canada option is generally shorthand for a wide-ranging free trade agreement which covers tariff-free access for goods, perhaps some harmonization of services, but not free movement. So it's essentially a free trade agreement, not a single market, and not a free movement area, as being a possible model for the UK's economic relationship with the EU post-Brexit.
I speak as somebody who sold his business to the French 11 years ago. The French and the Belgians are just like on your bikes, and that we need to be punished. So there's quite divided views across Europe. And I think one of the challenges in this whole process, of course, is that at the end, the European Parliament gets to vote on it. So even if the negotiators agree something, the Parliament may not. And what's going to, the tensions in the government's position around the jams, just about managing and how they're going to be feeling over the next few years, I think is fascinating, because the numbers look challenging if you believe the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Resolution Foundation, which not everybody does, of course. Liam Fox probably doesn't, but the numbers do look challenging. Who they will blame and where they will go if it doesn't root out as planned, given Corbyn's complete ineptitude, who knows?
I don't think you can trace it to a specific event that has sort of fueled, English identity. I know it's been a fairly consistent feature in the surveys that people who identified as English rather than British were outside of London were overwhelmingly more likely to say, right, I'm going to back Brexit. And that is why I think we got this sort of interesting debate emerging within Labour by sort of John Denham and Maurice Glasman and others about, what Englishness actually means politically, around whether they need to sort of start thinking about things like community and belonging more seriously. It's probably why today Paul Nuttall's running around a television studio saying that he's going to talk to a patriotic English working class, right? Because why bother talking to the Scots if you're the English Independence Party? And I think that's very much where that tension between Labour and the sort of radical right will come into play.
I think it's easy to exaggerate the extent to which the phenomenon of Englishness being linked with anti-immigrant attitudes is a new phenomenon. It isn't. I can point you to stuff I wrote 15 years ago indicating that those who have a sense of British identity are more likely to be in favour of multiculturalism, less concerned about immigration than are those who have an English identity. And I think to understand that, we need to remember the way in which Britishness has been reframed in England. The multicultural identity that's promoted by, for the want of a better word, the metropolitan liberal elite in the UK has been of Britishness. Yeah. Whereas Englishness, as it were, has been left. And actually, very few, one clue to this is that very few people who belong to the BAME population are willing to describe themselves in English. North of the border, it's very different. because the SNP have promoted Scottishness as a civic identity, those from a BME background are at least as likely from those from a non-BME background to describe themselves as Scottish. So again, framing is crucial here. But the framing of identity in England has been different from that in Scotland, and I think that's created this pattern of association. But I'm not sure whether people are voting for Brexit because they're English, as opposed to the fact that they're voting for Brexit because they don't like immigration, and that's long been associated with Englishness.
She's got an open goal. I mean, my view is basically assuming we have an election in 2020, Theresa May and her team, barring sort of conservative tendency for infighting, has got a pretty clear run until 2025. I mean, it's going to be impossible for. Never say impossible after 2016, but hey, I'll eat my book if it happens. But I just don't see Labour coming anywhere near, given the polling obstacles that they have to overcome. I mean, I was talking with John at the beginning of the conference. Labour needs to, as John's numbers suggest, Labour needs to be somewhere around 12.5 percentage points ahead in the polls to get a majority. I mean, this is not going to happen as long as Corbyn leads the Labour Party. So on the one nation Disraeli type conservatism, she's playing it smartly. She's saying to the aspirational blue-collar working class left behind that actually she can speak for them on Brexit and migration, which is going to cause a really big problem for UKIP on their radical right flank, because they don't really have that much to say other than, well, we're going to make sure Brexit means Brexit. Well, Theresa May's saying that as well.
I'll share with you my reaction when I heard Theresa May's conference speech. And it was, so somebody is basically arguing for what we might call socially responsible capitalism. And I thought, I wonder if the UK is now about to rediscover the continental Christian democracy that appears to have died across most of continental Europe, but maybe now is going to be revived in the UK. Would that not be an irony if that were a fallout from Brexit? That said, however, can I just point out that there was one crucial parenthetical rider in Matthew's portrayal of Theresa May's prospects, and that was if there isn't conservative infighting. And can I suggest to you that that is a pretty major rider, and that yes, we have a dysfunctional opposition. The question that still seems to be answered is whether we actually have a functional government or not. Okay. But I'll let Nicky Morgan answer that question in the next session.